They sent fake cops to evict me from my own home at 6 a.m., all because I refused to bow to a tyrant's illegal HOA. But Karen had no idea who she was messing with. By sunrise, I triggered a legal bomb using one forgotten line on an ancient map that would not only destroy her, but expose a nationwide property theft ring targeting families like mine. Comment below if your local HOA has ever played dirty games like this, because what happened next is going to make every Karen think twice about the ground beneath their feet. 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, and someone was pounding on my cabin door like they were trying to wake the dead. I opened my eyes in the small wooden cabin I'd called home for the past 3 years, nestled peacefully beside Lake Serenity. Through the window, I could see 2 men in what looked like law enforcement uniforms standing on my porch with the kind of rigid posture that screamed official business. One held what appeared to be a clipboard. The other had his hand resting near what I assumed was a radio. The whole scene had that practiced authority that makes most people automatically comply without asking questions. David Martinez, according to Temporary Community Management Order 447V, you are currently in violation of Provisional Community Standards. Please open the door so we can discuss your compliance status. The voice carried that particular blend of bureaucratic formality and barely contained aggression that I'd learned to recognize over my 45 years on this planet. Something about the whole situation felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what was bothering me. Maybe it was the way the morning light hit their badges. Or maybe it was just my natural skepticism kicking in after years of dealing with overzealous officials in my previous career as a land surveyor. I approached the door slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening, while my mind cataloged the details that weren't adding up. The badges read Lake County Sheriff, but the font looked wrong, almost like someone had tried to recreate it from memory rather than using official materials. More importantly, Lake County didn't have jurisdiction in this area. We fell under the authority of the state police and local municipal departments. The Temporary Community Management Order wasn't legal terminology I recognized either. And after dealing with municipal codes for 2 decades, I knew the language these documents typically used. These details might seem minor to most people, but when you've spent your career measuring property lines and navigating legal descriptions, you learn to notice when things don't match the official standards. I'll need to verify your credentials and the validity of this order before opening my door, I called out, already reaching for my phone to contact the actual authorities. The reaction was immediate and telling. Both men exchanged glances, and I caught one of them shaking his head slightly before they began backing toward their vehicle. If they were legitimate law enforcement, they would have expected verification requests and had proper procedures for handling them. Instead, they were uncomfortable with the prospect of having their authority questioned or documented.
"You haven't heard the last of this, Martinez," one of them called out as they climbed into their unmarked sedan. "Community standards will be enforced one way or another." The threat was delivered with enough menace to make most people reconsider their position, but it only confirmed my suspicions that something much larger was happening here. I watched them drive away while recording everything on my phone, making sure to capture their license plate and any other identifying details that might prove useful later.
2 weeks earlier, I'd received my first introduction to the woman who had turned my quiet retirement into a legal battlefield. Karen Whitmore had appeared at my door on a Tuesday afternoon with a kind of aggressive cheerfulness that always made me suspicious, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd introduced herself as the interim HOA coordinator for Lake Serenity Community, a title that seemed official enough to intimidate most people, but raised immediate red flags for someone with my background. The way she emphasized certain words when she spoke, particularly when she mentioned demographics and looked pointedly at my surname, told me everything I needed to know about her real motivations. "Hello there, Mr. Martinez. I'm Karen, and I've been elected to serve as the temporary coordinator for our new homeowners association. With all the recent changes in our community demographics, we need to ensure this area maintains appropriate standards for property values and community cohesion." Her tone suggested that my presence somehow threatened these mysterious standards, though she was careful to avoid saying anything explicitly discriminatory. The documents she thrust toward me detailed monthly fees, restrictions on everything from fishing to exterior paint colors, and penalties that seemed designed more to generate revenue than maintain any reasonable community standards. I'd dealt with legitimate HAs before, both professionally and personally, and nothing about Karen's presentation matched the legal requirements for establishing such an organization. I'm not interested in joining any association I didn't voluntarily choose to be part of, I told her, handing back her papers without bothering to read through the fabricated regulations. The transformation in her demeanor was immediate and revealing. The fake friendliness disappeared, replaced by the kind of cold calculation that suggested this wasn't her first time encountering resistance to her plans. You don't understand, Mr. Martinez. This isn't optional participation. According to state temporary community management provisions, all property owners in designated areas must comply with interim standards during the establishment period. She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd practiced this speech many times, but I caught the subtle tells that indicated she was improvising legal terminology rather than citing actual statutes. When someone spends their career working with government regulations, they develop an ear for authentic bureaucratic language versus creative interpretation. After she left, promising that I'd regret this decision, I did what any reasonable person would do. I started researching. What I found was both enlightening and disturbing. The Lake Serenity community didn't exist in any official county records, and Karen's application for HOA status was still pending approval due to insufficient homeowner signatures. More interesting was the pattern I discovered when I cross-referenced her targets for compliance visits. Every single property owner she'd approached shared one common characteristic. They all had Hispanic surnames. The Johnsons, the Millers, and the other established white families in the area had been given grace periods to consider their participation. My blood ran cold. Martinez, Santos, Rodriguez, Herrera. It wasn't about community standards. It was a purge. She wasn't collecting fees. She was trying to steal her heritage, one family at a time. That night, I opened the old wooden chest that contained my grandfather's life work, surveying equipment, and the family's land records dating back to 1887. What I found inside wasn't just history, it was a weapon. And it had Karen's name all over it. Among the carefully preserved documents was the original property deed that established my family's ownership of this land, purchased with savings from my great-grandfather's work building the railroad that connected this region to the outside world. As I studied the boundaries marked on the hand-drawn maps, a slow smile spread across my face. Karen Whitmore was about to learn that sometimes the quiet guy who just wants to be left alone knows exactly how to fight back when pushed too far. The morning visit had just declared war, and they had no idea I was holding the one weapon they could never counter, my own history. But before I could look at my grandfather's maps, I had to make one call to a real authority. I picked up the phone and dialed the real sheriff's office. Sheriff Johnson answered on the second ring, and when I explained what had just happened, his reaction was immediate and fierce. Someone was impersonating law enforcement officers at your property, Mr. Martinez. That's a federal crime. Did you get any footage or photos of these individuals? I could hear the anger building in his voice as I described the uniforms, the fake badges, and their hasty retreat when I asked for verification. He promised to send a deputy out within the hour to take my statement and begin an investigation into what he called a serious violation of public trust. While I waited for the deputy, I decided to dig deeper into Karen's background and her mysterious Lake Serenity community. What I found made my blood run cold. Using my professional database access from my surveying days, I discovered that Karen Whitmore had operated under at least two other names in Arizona and Nevada. In Arizona, she'd been Sandra White, targeting a Native American community near valuable casino development land. In Nevada, she'd used the name Karen Walsh while harassing elderly Hispanic property owners near a proposed golf course resort. The pattern was identical in every case: temporary community management orders, fake legal authority, and systematic harassment of minority property owners until they sold their land below market value. The more I researched, the clearer the picture became. Karen wasn't working alone, and this wasn't some small-time scam. Every one of her previous operations had ended with the same result. A mysterious development company would swoop in to purchase the abandoned properties at fire sale prices, then flip them to major resort or commercial developers for massive profits. The shell company behind these purchases was always different, but the financial trail led back to the same source, a massive corporation called Pinnacle Development with operations across 23 states. Deputy Mike Torres arrived just as I was printing out the most damning evidence I'd found. Mike was a second-generation Mexican-American like myself, and I could see the recognition in his eyes when I showed him the demographic patterns in Karen's targeting. Jesus, David, she's not just running some HOA scam. She's systematically going after Latino families specifically. Look at this list. Martinez, Santos, Rodriguez, Herrera. Every single family she's harassed has a Hispanic surname, while all the Anglo families got grace periods to consider participation. Mike's hands were shaking slightly as he reviewed the documentation I'd compiled. I have to tell you something, David. Karen approached me about 3 weeks ago, said she was concerned about community standards, and asked if I could help with enforcement issues when they arose. She made it sound like she was just trying to improve property values and reduce crime in the area. I thought I was helping my community, but now I see what she was asking me to do. The shame in his voice was palpable, but I could also hear the anger building as he realized how he'd been manipulated. She played on your desire to help your community, Mike. That's what makes her dangerous. She's smart enough to make good people complicit in her schemes without them realizing what they're supporting. I pulled out the county records I'd requested that morning, spreading them across my kitchen table like a battle plan. But here's where Karen made her biggest mistake. She assumed that because my family has Hispanic surnames, we must be recent immigrants without proper documentation or legal knowledge. She never bothered to research the actual history of this land. The original survey maps from 1887 told a story that would have terrified Karen if she'd bothered to look. My great-grandfather, Miguel Martinez, had purchased this entire section of land legally with money earned from his railroad construction work. The deed was clear, comprehensive, and had been properly recorded with the county for over a century. More importantly, the original survey boundaries extended far beyond my current cabin property. According to the historical records, my family owned not just the land my cabin sat on, but also the entire shoreline area where Karen had established her temporary HOA office. Mike, look at this boundary description, I said, pointing to the faded ink on the century-old document. The eastern boundary extends to the natural high water mark of the lake, thence following said watermark in a southerly direction for a distance of 2,000 feet. That office building Karen just had constructed for her HOA headquarters. It's sitting on land that legally belongs to me. The implications were staggering. Not only had Karen been operating an illegal temporary management scheme, she'd built her base of operations on property she had no right to use. Mike was quiet for a long moment, studying the maps and cross-referencing them with modern aerial photographs on his tablet. David, if this survey is accurate and the boundaries haven't been legally altered, then Karen isn't just running a scam. She's committed multiple felonies, fraud, impersonation of government officials, and now criminal trespass with permanent structures built on private property without permission. He looked up at me with something approaching awe. Do you realize what this means? Every single action she's taken, every fee she's collected, every threat she's made, it's all been based on authority she never legally possessed. The pieces of Karen's downfall were falling into place with beautiful precision. But I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. People like her didn't build multi-state criminal enterprises by backing down when challenged. Mike, I need you to understand something. When we move against Karen, she's going to escalate. She has too much invested in this operation to just walk away quietly. Are you prepared for what that might mean? His nod was firm and determined, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Neither of us could have imagined just how far Karen would be willing to go to protect her illegal empire. That evening, I sat on my porch overlooking the lake, watching the sunset behind Karen's illegal office building. Tomorrow, I would file the first legal challenges that would begin unraveling her entire operation. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Karen Whitmore had picked the wrong target when she decided to mess with the Martinez family. She was about to learn that sometimes the quiet guy with the old maps knows exactly how to bring down an empire built on lies. Karen's escalation came faster than I'd anticipated. The morning after I met with Deputy Torres, I woke to find my driveway blocked by an unmarked van and two men in security uniforms standing at strategic positions around my property. They weren't trying to hide their presence. This was pure intimidation designed to make me feel trapped and vulnerable. When I stepped onto my porch with my morning coffee, one of them called out, "Mr. Martinez, we're here to ensure community safety standards are maintained. You'll need to remain on your immediate property until compliance issues are resolved." The audacity was breathtaking, but it also confirmed that Karen was feeling desperate enough to escalate to direct physical intimidation. I didn't engage with her security theater. Instead, I calmly documented everything with my phone, making sure to capture their faces and the license plates of their vehicles, then called Sheriff Johnson directly. "Sheriff, Karen Whitmore has now posted what appear to be private security personnel on my property without permission. They're claiming authority to restrict my movement on my land." His response was swift and decisive. Within 20 minutes, two patrol cars arrived, and Karen's fake security team found themselves being questioned about their lack of permits, their employer, and their legal authority to operate in our jurisdiction. While the real deputies were dealing with Karen's latest stunt, I was preparing my counteroffensive. I'd spent the previous evening working with my civil rights attorney, Sarah Chin, to draft a comprehensive legal response that would attack Karen's operation from multiple angles simultaneously. Sarah was a specialist in housing discrimination cases, and when I'd shown her the evidence of Karen's systematic targeting of Hispanic families, her reaction had been immediate and fierce. "David, this isn't just HOA fraud. This is a clear pattern of civil rights violations under the Fair Housing Act. We can file federal charges that will destroy not just Karen's local operation, but potentially expose the entire Pinnacle Development Network." The centerpiece of our strategy was a civil rights complaint that documented the discriminatory pattern in Karen's enforcement actions. We had evidence showing that she demanded immediate compliance and threatened legal action against every Hispanic family in the area while giving extended grace periods and friendly consultations to white property owners. More damning was the recorded phone call Mike Torres had provided, where Karen explicitly discussed the need to maintain appropriate demographic balance in the community. Sarah was confident that this evidence alone would trigger a federal civil rights investigation that would shut down Karen's operation permanently. But our most devastating weapon was the historical property survey that proved Karen's entire HOA office was built on my family's land without permission. Sarah had worked with a certified land surveyor to verify the 1887 boundaries, and the results were unambiguous. Not only was Karen's building illegally constructed on my property, but her entire claim to manage the Lake Serenity community was based on authority over land she had no legal right to control. "This is going to be beautiful, David," Sarah told me as we reviewed the final complaint. "Karen has built her entire criminal enterprise on a foundation of sand, and we're about to wash it all away." The confrontation I'd been anticipating came that afternoon when Karen herself arrived at my property with what appeared to be a small army of supporters. She'd brought along several residents she'd convinced to join her fake HOA, a man she introduced as her legal counsel, and a woman with a professional camera who was documenting everything for community safety records. Karen was trying to create a public spectacle that would intimidate me into backing down, but she'd badly miscalculated my willingness to be pushed around. "Mr. Martinez," Karen announced loudly enough for her camera operator to capture every word, "you violate 17 separate community standards regulations. As the duly appointed interim coordinator for Lake Serenity Community, I am here to inform you that your continued non-compliance will result in formal enforcement actions, including potential removal from community participation." The theatrical nature of her performance was almost comical, but I could see that some of the residents she brought along were genuinely convinced she had legitimate authority. I let her finish her speech before responding with the calm, measured tone I'd perfected during years of dealing with difficult clients and hostile government officials. "Ms. Whitmore, I have several questions about your authority here. First, could you please provide documentation showing that the Lake Serenity Community HOA has been properly registered with the state? Second, could you explain under what legal theory you have the right to establish management authority over private property without the owner's consent? And finally, are you aware that your office building is constructed on land that belongs to my family? The change in Karen's demeanor was instantaneous and revealing. The confident authority she'd been projecting cracked, replaced by something approaching panic as she realized I wasn't just some confused homeowner who could be bullied into submission. Her legal counsel stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. Mr. Martinez, the Temporary Community Management Authority is established under state statutes regarding emergency community standards enforcement. Your family's historical claims are irrelevant to current zoning and management requirements. I smiled and pulled out the certified survey document Sarah and I had prepared. The historical claims are extremely relevant, especially when someone builds permanent structures on private property without permission. This survey, certified by both the county and state authorities, clearly shows that your office building is located on land that has belonged to the Martinez family since 1887. Every day you operate from that location, you're committing criminal trespass. I handed copies of the survey to Karen, her fake lawyer, and several of the residents who'd come to watch the confrontation. The reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. Karen's supporters began murmuring among themselves as they studied the clear official documentation that completely undermined her claims to authority. Her legal counsel was frantically flipping through the pages, clearly searching for some loophole or technicality that could salvage the situation. Most satisfying of all was Karen herself, who had gone pale as she realized that her entire operation was built on a legal foundation that didn't exist. "This is ridiculous!" Karen finally exploded, abandoning any pretense of legal authority in favor of raw indignation. "You can't just pull out some old piece of paper and claim ownership of community property. There are procedures. There are proper channels. There are people with real authority who need to review these claims." But even as she spoke, I could see that she knew the game was over. The residents she'd brought to intimidate me were now looking at her with suspicion and doubt, and her fake lawyer was quietly backing toward his car. "Ms. Whitmore," I said with the same calm tone I'd maintained throughout the confrontation, "you have 72 hours to remove your office building from my property. After that, I'll be filing for criminal trespass charges and civil damages for unauthorized use of private land. I'd also suggest you consult with actual legal counsel about your potential liability for the various federal crimes you've committed in establishing this fake HOA." As I spoke, I noticed Mike Torres pulling up in his patrol car, having arrived just in time to witness Karen's public meltdown. The crowd dispersed quickly after that, with Karen's supporters having second thoughts about their involvement in what was becoming a legal disaster. Karen herself left with threats about proper authorities and regulatory oversight, but the desperation in her voice told me that she knew her time was running out. As I watched her drive away, I felt a deep satisfaction that justice was finally beginning to catch up with someone who'd made a career of exploiting vulnerable families. The real fight was just beginning. But for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I was the one holding all the cards. Karen's response to my 72-hour ultimatum was swift, reckless, and exactly what I'd expected from someone cornered with no legal options left. Instead of removing her illegal office building, she doubled down in the most spectacular way possible. By Thursday morning, she'd hired what she called a private security firm that looked suspiciously like the kind of muscle you'd find outside a debt collector's office. These weren't the bumbling wannabe cops from her first attempt at intimidation. These were serious men with serious attitudes who positioned themselves around my property like they were guarding a federal courthouse. The escalation didn't stop there. Karen had also filed an emergency injunction claiming that I was a dangerous individual making terroristic threats against community safety. The paperwork was a masterpiece of creative legal fiction full of allegations about my extremist behavior, my anti-community militant stance, and my threats to disrupt peaceful neighborhood development. Reading through her emergency filing was like watching someone dig their own grave with a legal shovel. But I had to admire the audacity of someone who could file completely fabricated court documents with a straight face. What Karen didn't know was that Mike Torres had been conducting his investigation into her operation, and what he discovered was going to change everything. Mike had started by looking into the security firm Karen had hired, and within hours, he'd uncovered a web of connections that led straight back to the Pinnacle Development Corporation I'd researched earlier. The security company was a wholly owned subsidiary of Pinnacle, which meant Karen wasn't just some local scammer trying to make a quick buck off fake HOA fees. She was a well-funded operative in a much larger criminal enterprise. "David, you need to see this," Mike said when he arrived at my cabin that Thursday afternoon, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing the expression of someone who'd just solved a puzzle that made them sick to their stomach. "Karen's operation here isn't independent. She's being paid a monthly salary of $15,000 by Pinnacle Development, plus bonuses for every property they acquire through her community management activities. This isn't harassment for HOA fees. This is systematic property theft on an industrial scale." The documents Mike had uncovered painted a picture that was both more complex and more disturbing than I'd initially realized. Pinnacle Development had operations in 23 states, all following the same basic model that Karen was implementing here. They would identify communities with valuable land owned by minority families, then deploy community coordinators who would establish fake temporary management authority and systematically harass property owners until they sold their land below market value. The company had acquired over 400 properties this way, generating an estimated $400 million in profits from what was essentially a massive organized crime operation, disguised as community development. "There's more," Mike continued, his voice tight with anger. "I found recorded phone calls between Karen and her Pinnacle supervisors where she explicitly discusses targeting problematic demographics and using cultural pressure points to encourage voluntary relocation. They're not just stealing land, they're doing it by exploiting racial and ethnic prejudices in a systematic way that would make the old redlining practices look subtle by comparison." The recordings Mike had obtained were damning beyond anything I'd imagined possible. In one particularly revealing conversation, Karen discussed how Hispanic families were naturally more compliant with authority figures and could be efficiently managed through official-sounding documentation and uniformed personnel. In another, she talked about the importance of maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring that undesirable elements understood they weren't welcome in communities targeted for upgrade and development. But the most shocking revelation came when Mike showed me the internal Pinnacle documents outlining their long-term strategy for the Lake Serenity area. This wasn't just about acquiring a few properties for resale. Pinnacle was planning to transform the entire lakefront into a luxury resort and golf course development that would generate hundreds of millions in revenue. My family's property, along with the Santos, Rodriguez, and Herrera families' land, was all that stood between Pinnacle and a massive payday that would completely transform the character of our community. "They've already got preliminary agreements with a major hotel chain and 2 golf course designers," Mike explained as he spread out the planning documents on my kitchen table. "The whole project is contingent on acquiring what they call the remaining non-compliant properties in the target area. Karen's job is to make sure those acquisitions happen by any means necessary, legal or otherwise." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but it also meant that we now had evidence of federal crimes that went far beyond simple HOA fraud. The recordings and documents Mike had gathered would support charges of civil rights violations, conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering under the federal RICO statute. "Mike, this evidence doesn't just incriminate Karen. This could bring down the entire Pinnacle Development Network and put a lot of very wealthy people in federal prison for a very long time." As if on cue, my phone rang with a call from Sarah Chen, who had been working with federal prosecutors to review our civil rights complaint. "David, I have news that's going to make your day. The FBI's Civil Rights Division wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. They've been investigating Pinnacle Development for similar activities in other states, and your case provides the missing pieces they need to file federal racketeering charges against the entire organization." The next morning's meeting with FBI agent Lisa Park was a revelation that expanded the scope of our case beyond anything I'd imagined possible. Agent Park explained that the FBI had been tracking Pinnacle Development's activities across multiple states, but had been unable to penetrate their operational security until Mike Torres had provided the recordings and internal documents from Karen's operation. Mr. Martinez, your refusal to be intimidated has given us the evidence we need to dismantle a criminal organization that has victimized hundreds of families and stolen hundreds of millions of dollars in property value. Agent Park's investigation had revealed that Pinnacle Development was connected to corrupt officials in at least 12 states, including building inspectors, county commissioners, and even some federal employees who had been providing inside information about environmental regulations and zoning changes. Karen Whitmore is just one operative in a network that includes former government officials, corrupt law enforcement personnel, and legitimate business people who've been compromised through bribes or blackmail. Taking down this organization is going to require a coordinated federal response. The meeting concluded with Agent Park asking me to continue my normal activities while wearing a recording device in hopes that Karen would incriminate herself further when she inevitably tried to escalate her intimidation campaign. Mr. Martinez, based on the psychological profiles we've developed of Pinnacle operatives, Karen is going to become increasingly desperate as she realizes her operation is failing. Desperate people make mistakes, and those mistakes are going to help us build an airtight case against everyone involved in this conspiracy.
As I drove home from the FBI meeting, I reflected on how dramatically my quiet retirement had been transformed. 3 weeks ago, I was a former land surveyor who just wanted to fish and read books by the lake. Now I was an undercover operative in a federal investigation that could reshape how property rights are protected across the entire United States. Karen Whitmore had picked the wrong target when she decided to mess with the Martinez family. But more importantly, she'd accidentally triggered a federal investigation that would expose a criminal conspiracy affecting hundreds of families just like mine. The irony wasn't lost on me that Karen's attempt to steal my family's land was about to result in the protection of countless other families' properties across the country. Sometimes justice works in mysterious ways, and sometimes the quiet guy with the old maps ends up being exactly the right person in exactly the right place to make a real difference. What would you do if you discovered your local HOA was part of a multi-million-dollar land theft operation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about how communities can protect themselves from these kinds of schemes. Thanks for following along with this story, and stay tuned for the next chapter where things get even more intense. This is Jason Miller from Chicago, and I appreciate you taking this journey with me. Karen's desperation reached new heights when she realized that her usual intimidation tactics weren't working, and that serious federal attention was now focused on her operation. The morning after I met with Agent Park, I discovered that Karen had escalated to what could only be described as psychological warfare. She'd posted flyers throughout the community claiming that I was under federal investigation for domestic terrorism and anti-government activities, complete with my photo and a warning for neighbors to report any suspicious behavior to local authorities immediately. The flyers were professionally printed and designed to look like official government warnings, complete with fake FBI logos and contact information that led to answering services staffed by Karen's associates. The psychological impact on the community was immediate, and exactly what Karen had intended. Neighbors who had previously been friendly began crossing the street to avoid me, and I noticed several people taking photos of my cabin and vehicle throughout the day. The local grocery store clerk asked me directly if I was that terrorist guy mentioned in the flyers, and even the postal worker seemed nervous when delivering my mail. Karen had successfully weaponized the community's fears and patriotic instincts to isolate me socially, while she prepared whatever final desperate move she was planning. But Karen's tactics were about to backfire in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Agent Park had warned me that Pinnacle operatives often tried to discredit their targets through disinformation campaigns, and the FBI had been monitoring Karen's communications since our meeting. When Karen distributed her fake terrorism warnings, she'd inadvertently committed multiple federal crimes, including impersonating federal authorities, mail fraud, and witness intimidation in a federal investigation. More importantly, her communications with Pinnacle headquarters about neutralizing the Martinez problem had been intercepted and recorded by federal surveillance teams.
Mike Torres called me that afternoon with news that would change everything about our situation. David, you're not going to believe what just happened. The FBI executed simultaneous search warrants on Karen's office, her home, and 3 Pinnacle development facilities in different states. They've arrested Karen, 2 Pinnacle executives, and a county building inspector who's been taking bribes for over 5 years. The raids had been planned for weeks, but Karen's latest escalation had provided the final evidence needed to move forward with federal charges. The extent of the evidence seized during the raids was staggering. Federal agents had recovered over 10,000 documents detailing Pinnacle's operations across multiple states, including detailed demographic studies of target communities, psychological profiles of property owners likely to resist their tactics, and financial records showing bribes paid to dozens of local officials. Most damaging of all were the recorded strategy sessions where Pinnacle executives discussed using cultural intimidation and ethnic pressure points to force minority families to abandon their properties. Agent Park met with me that evening to brief me on the developments and explain how the investigation would proceed. Mr. Martinez, Karen's arrest is just the beginning. We now have evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving over 200 individuals across 23 states, including current and former government officials, private security contractors, and real estate developers. The charges we're filing include racketeering, civil rights violations, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion under color of law. The most shocking revelation came when Agent Park showed me the organizational chart they'd assembled based on the seized documents. Pinnacle Development wasn't just a real estate company. It was essentially a criminal enterprise that had infiltrated local governments across the country. They'd placed operatives in county offices, building departments, and even sheriff's departments, creating a network that could manufacture legal authority and official documentation to support their property acquisition schemes. David, your case has exposed a level of corruption that we haven't seen since the organized crime investigations of the 1970s. The impact on the local community was immediate and dramatic. Within hours of Karen's arrest, 3 other families came forward to report similar harassment they'd experienced but had been too frightened to report earlier. The Santos family revealed that Karen had threatened to have their teenage son arrested for gang activity if they didn't sell their property, while the Rodriguez couple disclosed that she'd filed false reports with Adult Protective Services, claiming they were being neglected by their children. Each new revelation painted a picture of systematic intimidation designed to terrorize vulnerable families into abandoning their homes. But the most satisfying development came when the county conducted an emergency review of all permits and approvals granted during Karen's operation. The review revealed that Karen's HOA office building had been constructed without any valid permits whatsoever, using forged documents and bribed inspections. The building was immediately condemned as an illegal structure, and demolition was scheduled to begin within the week. Watching the demolition crews arrive to tear down Karen's fake authority center felt like watching justice take shape before my eyes. The federal investigation also revealed the true scope of Pinnacle's plans for our community. The seized documents included architectural renderings and financial projections for a massive resort development that would have displaced every existing resident and transformed Lake Serenity into an exclusive playground for wealthy tourists. The project would have generated over $600 million in revenue for Pinnacle while destroying a community that had existed for over a century. Seeing those plans made me realize that our fight hadn't just been about property rights. It had been about preserving an entire way of life that corporate greed was trying to erase. As news of the arrests and the federal investigation spread through media coverage, I began receiving calls from families in other states who had experienced similar harassment from Pinnacle operatives. Each story followed the same pattern: fake government authority, systematic intimidation, and pressure to sell property below market value to mysterious development companies. The FBI established a hotline for victims to report their experiences, and within 48 hours, they'd received over 300 calls from across the country. The realization that our local fight had become a national civil rights case was both overwhelming and deeply satisfying. Karen Whitmore's attempt to steal my family's land had inadvertently exposed a criminal conspiracy that had victimized hundreds of families and corrupted dozens of local governments. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never intended to fight. And sometimes standing up for your rights ends up protecting the rights of people you'll never meet. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was packed with media, victims, and observers when the Pinnacle Development racketeering trial began 6 months after Karen's arrest. I sat in the witness section surrounded by families from 12 different states who had experienced the same systematic harassment and intimidation that had brought me into this fight. The scope of the trial was unprecedented, with federal prosecutors presenting evidence of a criminal conspiracy that had operated for over 8 years and affected more than 400 families across the country. Taking a witness stand as the government's primary witness was both nerve-wracking and deeply satisfying. Federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh had prepared me extensively for this moment, but standing before a packed courtroom and describing how Karen's fake HOA had tried to steal my family's land felt surreal. "Mr. Martinez," she began, "please tell the court how you first became aware that the Lake Serenity Community HOA was not a legitimate organization." As I described that first morning when Karen appeared at my door with her fake authority and discriminatory demands, I could see several jury members shaking their heads in disgust. The most powerful moment of my testimony came when Prosecutor Walsh asked me to explain the historical significance of my family's land ownership. "Your Honor, my great-grandfather, Miguel Martinez, purchased this land in 1887 with money he earned building the railroad that connected our region to the rest of the country. He was a legal immigrant who believed in the American dream of owning property and building a better life for his family. When Karen Whitmore tried to steal that land using fake government authority and racial intimidation, she wasn't just attacking my family. She was attacking the fundamental principle that all Americans, regardless of their surname or accent, have the right to own property and live peacefully on their land. The defense team representing Karen and the Pinnacle executives tried desperately to portray their clients as legitimate business people who had simply made some regulatory mistakes in their community development activities. Karen's lawyer argued that she had genuinely believed she had the authority to establish temporary community management and that any discrimination was unintentional. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming, including recordings of Karen explicitly discussing racial targeting strategies and internal Pinnacle documents that described minority property owners as acquisition opportunities, rather than human beings with rights. The most damaging testimony came from Mike Torres, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation with the federal investigation. Mike's detailed account of how Karen had manipulated him into supporting her operation was devastating, particularly when he described how she had exploited his desire to help his community to make him complicit in her crimes. "She made me believe I was protecting my neighbors from crime and disorder," Mike testified, his voice heavy with shame and anger. "But what she was asking me to do was help her terrorize Hispanic families into abandoning their homes so a corporation could steal their property." The prosecution also presented evidence of the broader Pinnacle conspiracy, including testimony from FBI financial investigators who had traced the money flows between Pinnacle headquarters and dozens of local operatives across the country. The scheme had generated over $400 million in profits for Pinnacle while causing immeasurable harm to the communities and families they had targeted. Special Agent Lisa Park testified about the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy, explaining how Pinnacle had created an entire infrastructure of fake authority and corrupted officials to support their property acquisition activities. But the most shocking revelation came when federal prosecutors presented evidence that Pinnacle's operations had been directly supported by corruption within the Department of Housing and Urban Development. 2 HUD officials had been providing Pinnacle with advanced information about federal housing programs and environmental regulations, allowing the company to target communities that would soon become more valuable due to government investments. This wasn't just private sector greed, Prosecutor Walsh explained to the jury. This was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal government and corrupted the very agencies meant to protect American homeowners. The trial's climax came when Pinnacle CEO Jonathan Pierce took the stand in his defense and was systematically destroyed by cross-examination. Prosecutor Walsh methodically walked him through internal company documents that showed he had personally approved the demographic targeting strategies and had received detailed reports on the ethnic pressure tactics being used by operatives like Karen. When Pierce tried to claim ignorance of the discriminatory nature of Pinnacle's operations, Walsh played recordings of executive meetings where he had explicitly discussed the need to clear out undesirable populations from target development areas. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Karen, Pierce, and the other Pinnacle defendants. The judge's sentencing was swift and severe, reflecting the scope of the conspiracy and the harm it had caused to hundreds of families. Karen received 8 years in federal prison for civil rights violations, fraud, and racketeering, while Pierce was sentenced to 15 years and ordered to pay $290 million in restitution to victims of the conspiracy. But the most significant outcome of the trial was the legal precedent it established. Federal Judge Patricia Kim's ruling created what legal scholars immediately dubbed the Martinez Doctrine, which made corporate-sponsored fake HOAs a specific federal crime and established enhanced penalties for property acquisition schemes that target minority communities. This court finds that the defendants engaged in a systematic campaign to deprive American citizens of their constitutional rights based on their race and ethnicity, Judge Kim stated during sentencing. Such conduct strikes at the very heart of what it means to be an American, and this court will ensure that the penalties reflect the severity of these crimes. The personal vindication I felt watching Karen being led away in handcuffs was profound, but it was overshadowed by the knowledge that our fight had created protections for countless other families. The Martinez Property Protection Act, federal legislation inspired by our case, was signed into law 6 months later, creating a national framework for preventing and prosecuting fake HOA schemes. Standing in the Rose Garden as the president signed the bill that bore my family's name was a moment I never could have imagined when I first refused to join Karen's fake lake association. 3 years after the federal trial that dismantled the Pinnacle development conspiracy, I found myself standing on the same wooden dock where this entire journey had begun, watching the sunrise paint Lake Serenity in shades of gold and crimson. The lake had officially been renamed Martinez Lake by the county commissioners, a gesture that honored not just my family's century-long connection to this land, but also the role our fight had played in protecting property rights across the entire nation. The simple wooden sign bearing the new name had become something of a pilgrimage site for civil rights advocates and families who had been inspired by our story to stand up against similar injustices in their own communities. The transformation of our community in the aftermath of Karen's defeat had been remarkable to witness. The Santos family had used their portion of the federal restitution fund to expand their small organic farm into a thriving business that supplied restaurants throughout the region. The Rodriguez couple had been able to afford the medical care they needed for Mrs. Rodriguez's diabetes, and their grandchildren now visited every summer to fish in the same waters where their grandfather had taught me to tie flies decades ago. Most importantly, the community had established the Lake Serenity Property Rights Foundation, which provided legal assistance to families facing similar harassment from fake HOAs or corrupt development schemes. My role as an advocate for property rights had evolved far beyond anything I could have imagined during my quiet retirement years. The Martinez Property Protection Act had created a federal office dedicated to investigating fake HOA schemes, and I served on the advisory board that helped train federal agents to recognize the warning signs of these sophisticated criminal operations. Every month, I received invitations to speak at legal conferences, community meetings, and congressional hearings about the importance of protecting property rights from corporate manipulation and government corruption. The most rewarding aspect of this unexpected second career was the direct assistance I could provide to families facing situations similar to what we had experienced. The federal hotline established after the Pinnacle investigation had grown into a comprehensive support network that connected victims with legal resources, documented patterns of abuse, and coordinated federal law enforcement responses to emerging threats. In the past year alone, we had helped shut down fake HOA operations in 7 states and secured over $50 million in restitution for affected families. One particularly satisfying case had involved a Native American reservation in Montana, where a company calling itself Tribal Land Management Services had been using forged federal documents to pressure tribal members into abandoning their ancestral lands. The tactics were identical to what Karen had attempted here: fake government authority, systematic intimidation, and exploitation of cultural vulnerabilities to force property transfers. Working with tribal attorneys and federal investigators, we were able to expose the scheme before any families lost their homes, and the perpetrators received sentences that matched the severity of their crimes against indigenous communities. The personal reconciliation I'd experienced with some of the people who had initially supported Karen's operation had been one of the most unexpected developments of the past 3 years. Several neighbors who had been convinced by her fake terrorism flyers eventually approached me to apologize and ask how they could help prevent similar deceptions in the future. These conversations led to the creation of community education programs that taught residents how to verify the legitimacy of HOA claims and recognize the warning signs of property acquisition schemes targeting their neighborhoods. Perhaps the most surprising visitor I'd received was Karen herself, who had been released on parole after serving 6 years of her 8-year sentence. Her appearance at my door on a gray October morning had initially filled me with the same weariness I'd felt during our first encounter. But the woman who stood on my porch was fundamentally different from the arrogant, manipulative operative who had tried to steal my family's land. Prison had clearly been a transformative experience for her, and her work with legal aid organizations helping other victims of corporate property schemes seemed genuine rather than performative. "David, I know I can't undo the harm I caused to you and the other families," she had said, her voice carrying a humility that would have been impossible to imagine from the Karen I'd first met. "But I've spent every day of the past 6 years trying to understand how I became someone who could treat people the way I treated you. I'm working with legal aid now, helping families that people like me hurt. It's not about forgiveness or redemption. It's about using my knowledge of these schemes to prevent future harm." I hadn't forgiven her, and I'd made that clear. But I had acknowledged that her current work was valuable, and that change, even incomplete change, was better than continued harm. The broader impact of our case continued to ripple through American legal and political systems in ways that reminded me daily of how individual acts of resistance could create lasting institutional change. Law schools now taught courses on Martinez Doctrine applications, and the case had become a standard reference point for civil rights attorneys handling housing discrimination cases. More importantly, the federal legislation inspired by our fight had been strengthened twice by subsequent congressional action, creating increasingly robust protections for property owners and enhanced penalties for corporations that tried to circumvent legitimate legal processes. As I prepared for another day of calls from families seeking help with their own property rights battles, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of justice and community had evolved since that first morning when Karen appeared at my door. I'd learned that sometimes the most important fight you can have is the one you never wanted, and that standing up for your rights often means protecting the rights of people you'll never meet. The quiet retirement I'd planned had been replaced by something far more demanding, but infinitely more meaningful. The phone rang with a call from a family in Texas whose elderly grandmother was being pressured to sell her farm to a company claiming eminent domain authority for a private development project. As I reached for the phone, I smiled at the irony that Karen's attempt to steal my family's historical connection to this land had ended up strengthening the property rights of countless other American families. Sometimes justice works in mysterious ways. And sometimes the best revenge is making sure the people who hurt you can never hurt anyone else the same way again. Has your HA ever overstepped its boundaries or targeted your family unfairly? You're not alone. Like David Martinez, millions of Americans face property harassment from fake authorities who exploit our trust in the system. This story proves that ordinary people can fight back against corruption when armed with knowledge and determination. Your property rights matter, and your voice deserves to be heard. This is why HOA Unfiltered exists, to expose the Karens and give you the tools to fight back. If this story proves anything, it's that knowledge is power. You are not alone. If you've been targeted, tell us your story in the comments. Like and subscribe for more real stories of justice, because your property rights are worth fighting for.